The cold hit her knees first. Stone floor, damp straw. Sienna Hayes kept her eyes down, because looking up cost more than she had left to spend. Say it again. The acolyte's voice was bright with the kind of cruelty that only comes from someone who has never once been afraid for their life. Louder, so the others hear you. Sienna's jaw ached from clenching it. Around her, the other caretakers had gone very still, the way prey goes still. Nobody helped. Nobody ever helped. They are empty vessels, she said. Not people. It came out flat, practiced. 13 years of practice, and it still tasted like glass going down. Good girl. The acolyte crouched close enough that Sienna could smell the cloying sweetness of temple incense clinging to his robes. Your mother used to be someone, didn't she? Before she was. He gestured, almost bored, at the rows of silent, hollow-eyed bodies lining the ward behind her. This. Something in Sienna's chest went white-hot and very, very quiet. She did not answer. She had learned, a long time ago, that silence was the only weapon she was allowed to carry. The acolyte straightened, already losing interest, already turning toward easier prey. Wards closing early tonight. Patrols doubling the perimeter roads. He said it like a threat. It was one. Curfew's in an hour. I'd hate for you to be caught out after. He walked away without waiting to see if she understood. Sienna understood perfectly. The perimeter roads were the only roads home that didn't cut through the whispering woods. And the woods were forbidden, for reasons nobody quite agreed on, except that everyone agreed on the fear. She rose from the floor slowly, joints protesting, dignity intact only because she had learned to hide the exact moment it broke. Behind her, in the last bed by the wall, her mother's eyes tracked nothing, stared at nothing, had stared at nothing for 13 years. I'll be back before the bell, Sienna whispered, low enough that only the two hollows in that corner could have heard it. If hearing was still something they did. I promise. She didn't know if her mother could still hear promises. She made them anyway. It was the only prayer she had left, that didn't require a god who'd already proven he wasn't listening. Outside, the sky had gone the color of a fresh bruise. An hour until curfew. No safe road home. Sienna pulled her hood up and started walking toward the trees everyone in Silverhorn was afraid of. The vial was smaller than her thumb, and it still felt heavier than anything else she owned. Sienna knelt beside her father's cot, hands steady out of habit rather than calm. The ward at night was a different kind of quiet, not peaceful, just paused. Rows of bodies breathing without dreaming, hearts beating without wanting anything. She uncorked the vial. The smell hit her first, the way it always did, bitter, mineral, faintly like burnt hair. Ashroot. Just a little longer, she murmured, though her father couldn't hear her either. Nobody could hear her in here. That was the point. She tipped the liquid back and swallowed. It burned going down. It always burned. 13 years and her body had never once stopped fighting it, never once decided this was normal. Which, she supposed, was the only part of her that still remembered what normal used to feel like. Her hands trembled, just slightly, gripping the edge of the cot. She breathed through it. In, out. Wait for the shaking to pass. Lately it took longer to pass. She didn't let herself think too hard about what that meant. Thinking about it wouldn't change the math. Ashroot or exposure. Exposure meant her mother and father, already hollowed, already stripped of everything that made them people, her own body's secret, would be dragged into daylight along with her. No, better the burn. She smoothed the blanket over her father's chest, the same motion she'd made every night for over a decade. Muscle memory standing in for a conversation neither of them would ever have again. I found something today, she told him anyway. In the market. A new tincture recipe. I think it might slow the burn. A pause. I know you can't tell me if that's a good idea. I'm going to do it anyway. The ward bell rang, somewhere above her, sharp and sudden in the stillness. Curfew patrol. Early. Sienna's whole body went taut. She capped the empty vial, tucked it into her coat, and rose in one motion, the ache in her knees forgotten, under a sharper, colder ache. Fear. The safe roads would already be watched? She looked once more at her parents, twin silhouettes in the dim lamplight, and made a decision she'd been circling for an hour, without admitting it. The woods, then. Whatever waited in there, It had never once, in 13 years, hurt her worse than the world outside them already had. The trees swallowed the light first, then the sound. Sienna hadn't taken 3 steps into the whispering woods before the ordinary noise of the city, distant bells, dog barks, the creak of shutters, simply stopped, like a hand closing over her ears. What replaced it was worse. A hush so complete it felt deliberate. Watching. She told herself that was superstition. She told herself that twice. Her boots sank into wet moss, silent, and she kept close to the tree line, one hand trailing along bark that felt too smooth, too cold, like something that had been carved rather than grown. The old stories said the woods remembered things, ate things. Sienna had never put much stock in old stories until she was standing inside one, and the dark pressed close enough to taste. Something shifted, off to her left. A branch, maybe. Or maybe not. Her pulse kicked hard against her throat. She stopped walking, waited. Nothing. Just the wind, she breathed, not believing it, and made herself move again. Faster now. Her earlier caution burning off into something closer to a jog. The patrol would be at the eastern gate in 20 minutes. She had that long to make it home before someone found her out past curfew, in the one place no one was allowed to be found at all. A low sound rolled through the trees ahead of her. Not wind, not an animal she recognized. A groan. Human. Or close enough to human to stop her cold. Every instinct she owned screamed at her to run the other way. She had survived 13 years by being the girl who never went looking for trouble, who kept her head down, who minded exactly what was hers to mind. She took a step toward the sound anyway. Hello? Barely a whisper. Her voice didn't want to be louder than that, not here. No answer. Just that terrible wet groan again, closer now, and beneath it, something that made her stomach drop before her mind caught up to why. The metallic tang of blood, a lot of it. Sienna's caretaker instincts, 13 years deep and utterly involuntary, took over before her fear could finish arguing its case. She was already moving, already pushing through a curtain of low branches. And then her foot caught on something enormous, and warm, and unmistakably alive, and she went down hard onto her knees beside it, breath knocked out of her in a single sharp gasp. A body. Massive. Bleeding into the moss beneath him, like the forest itself was drinking him down. For one long second, Sienna simply stared. He was enormous, even collapsed, even broken. There was no mistaking the size of him. Shoulders built for a battlefield, hands large enough to crush stone. And laced under his skin, spreading from a wound at his side like ink dropped in water, ran veins the color of pitch, black blight veins. She'd read about it. She'd never seen it outside a diagram. He was dying, and he was dying fast. Panic tried to claw its way up her throat. She shoved it back down, the way she'd shoved it down 100 times over hollowed bodies that couldn't thank her for it. This was no different. This was just a body that needed help. She pressed 2 fingers to the pulse point at his throat, weak, thready, racing. Ash blight, she murmured, half to herself, cataloging symptoms out of pure reflex. Advanced. You should already be dead. A low, broken sound answered her. Not words, just pain given a voice. Sienna's hands were already moving, already digging through the small kit she carried everywhere, out of habit, out of 13 years of never knowing when someone might need her. Ashroot, the same bitter poison she drank every night to survive her own secret. She'd never once considered it might treat someone else's. This is going to burn, she told him, uncorking the vial with fingers that had gone perfectly, professionally steady. I'm sorry, there isn't a version of this that doesn't. She pressed the vial to his lips, forced a slow, careful measure past them. His whole body seized, then gradually stilled. His breathing, ragged a moment ago, began to even out beneath her hands. Up close, in the moonlight bleeding through the canopy, she could see his face for the first time. Sharp, brutal lines, even slack with pain. Not a face she recognized. Not that it mattered. Nobody who ran in her circles overlapped with a man built like this. His eyes cracked open, found hers, held. Sienna didn't flinch away from it, the way she'd flinched from an overseer's gaze or a priest's. She looked back, steady, and said the truest thing she had. You have maybe 6 months if you're lucky, and nothing changes. That wound will heal, the blight underneath it won't. I can't cure it. I don't think anyone can. A beat. I'm sorry. You deserve to hear that plainly, not dressed up. He said nothing, just watched her, something unreadable moving behind that pained, glassy stare. She rose before he could ask her name, before whatever this was could become anything more than what it needed to be. A stranger, a wound, a truth spoken and left behind. "Curfew," she said, mostly to herself, and walked back into the dark, without looking back once. They came for her before dawn. Sienna woke to the sound of her door splintering off its hinges, and for one disoriented heartbeat, she thought the priests had finally found the thing she'd spent 13 years hiding. Then hands were hauling her upright, palace guard armor catching the gray pre-dawn light, and the thought curdled into something worse. Sienna Hayes. It wasn't a question. The guard who said it didn't bother looking at her while he said it, like her name was an item on a list to be checked off. "You're coming with us." "On whose order?" Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was the only victory she had time to notice before they were moving, half dragging her out into the street. No answer, just the tight, closed-off silence of men who'd been told not to explain themselves. Her mind raced ahead of her feet, cataloging every possible reason, discarding each one faster than the last. The woods. Someone had seen her in the woods? Or the man, the bleeding, blighted stranger she'd left in the moss, had woken and talked, had described the girl who healed him with a poison no ordinary caretaker should have known how to use. Either way, it ended the same. Exposure. Her parents unprotected. Everything she'd built, undone in the space of one wrong road home. The city blurred past, shuttered stalls, empty market squares, the looming silhouette of the palace growing larger with every forced step. Sienna had passed that palace 1,000 times in her life, and never once imagined she'd cross its threshold as anything but staff. She wasn't staff today. "Please," she tried once, quiet, aimed at no guard in particular. "My parents, if something happens to me, they need—" "Not my concern." The guard's grip tightened, not cruel, just final. "Court's waiting." Court. The word landed like a stone in her stomach. Court meant witnesses. Court meant an audience for whatever came next, and audiences, in Sienna's experience, only ever gathered for two things: spectacle or punishment. She thought of her mother's blank, unseeing eyes, thought of 13 years spent making herself small enough not to be noticed, undone in a single night she couldn't even fully account for. The palace gates groaned open ahead of her, swallowing the last of the dawn light. Sienna straightened her spine, because it was the only thing left she had any control over, and walked into whatever waited for her on the other side, already certain, with the flat, resigned clarity of someone who has never once been shown mercy, that she would not be walking back out. The court doors opened onto more gold than Sienna had seen in her entire life, and every inch of it was aimed at her. She was shoved forward into a sea of silk and silence, the assembled aristocracy parting just enough to let her through, close enough that she could feel their attention like heat against her skin. Whispers rippled outward from where she stood. She caught fragments. "The caretaker, from the ward, why is she?" and kept her eyes fixed forward, refusing to give them the satisfaction of watching her flinch. A line of young women stood along the dais, dressed in a splendor Sienna couldn't have imagined owning. Luna candidates. She recognized the arrangement instantly. She'd heard the rumors for weeks, the king finally choosing a mate, the whole court holding its breath for the announcement. She almost laughed. Whatever mistake had dragged her here, it clearly had nothing to do with that. Then the throne's occupant rose, and the breath went straight out of her lungs. It was him. The blood was gone, the wounds stitched and hidden beneath dark, formal robes. But there was no mistaking that face, those eyes, the same unreadable weight behind them she'd knelt across from in the moss less than a day ago. Darius Blackwood, the mad alpha king of Silverhorn. The man she told plainly that he had 6 months left to live. Her mind scrambled to catch up as he stepped down from the dais, past the Luna candidates, past the aristocracy holding its breath, past every expectation in the room, and stopped directly in front of her. The whispers died into total silence. "This one," he said. His voice was low, even, carrying easily across a room that had gone utterly still to hear it. "I claim Sienna Hayes as my consort." The words didn't make sense at first, then they did, and the floor seemed to tilt beneath her. Gasps broke out around the hall. Outrage, disbelief, something sharper underneath both. Sienna barely heard any of it. She was staring up at him, searching that carved, unreadable face for some explanation, some sign this was a mistake about to be corrected. He didn't blink, didn't waver. Held her gaze the way he'd held it in the woods, steady, deliberate, like he'd already decided something she hadn't been told yet. "Your Majesty," she started, low, urgent, meant only for him. "Later," he said, quiet enough that only she could hear it. And something in his tone told her this was not, in fact, a mistake at all. The private chamber they brought her to was smaller than the throne room and somehow more suffocating. Sienna stood rigid near the door, arms crossed tight over her chest, watching Darius cross to a side table and pour something from a decanter he didn't offer to share. He moved like a man used to being obeyed, but there was a tightness at his jaw that hadn't been there on the dais, something closer to exhaustion than command. "You have exactly one chance to explain yourself," she said, "before I start screaming loud enough for that entire court to hear it." That got his attention. A corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "You saved my life last night. I think that earns you a conversation before the screaming. You claimed me, in front of the entire aristocracy, without asking." "Yes." "That's it? Yes? Would an apology change anything?" He set the glass down untouched and finally looked at her directly. "I needed a reason the court would accept for why I suddenly required a healer at my side, permanently, without question. A consort no one can challenge. You fit." Something cold settled in Sienna's stomach. Not quite betrayal, since he'd never promised her anything to betray. Just a clean, clinical use of her, same as everything else in her life had ever been. "So I'm a bandage," she said flatly, "with a title. You're the only person in this empire who's told me the truth about my own condition without flinching." His voice dropped, quieter now, something almost raw beneath the composure. "That's rarer than you think, in a palace like this one." She studied him, really studied him, the way she'd studied his veins in the moonlit woods, looking for the truth underneath the surface. Whatever else this was, he wasn't lying about that part. "If I do this," she said slowly, testing the shape of the offer before she committed to it, "I have one condition. Name it. You fund my research. All of it, no questions, no oversight. I'm trying to reverse what the severing does to people like my parents. If I'm going to play your consort in front of a court that hates me on sight, I want something real out of it." For the first time since she'd met him, something like genuine surprise crossed his face. Then, slowly, he extended his hand. "Done," he said. "But you should know the court won't forgive this quietly. Neither will the priests." Sienna shook his hand anyway. "Good," she said. "Neither will I." Her new quarters smelled of nothing but cold stone and cedar, and it took Sienna nearly an hour of standing motionless in the center of them to accept that they were in fact hers now. Everything about the room was wrong in a way she couldn't quite name. Too large, too clean, a bed built for someone who mattered in a wing of the palace she'd never have been allowed to walk through a day ago. A knock interrupted the thought, sharp, unhurried, the knock of someone who didn't actually need permission to enter. She opened the door to find a woman in priesthood gray, older, sharp-eyed, smiling in a way that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. "The new consort," the woman said, gliding past Sienna into the room without waiting to be invited. "How unexpected. The court's still recovering, I think." Her gaze swept the space, cataloging, assessing. "Tell me, how does a ward caretaker come to catch a king's eye so suddenly? It's quite the story, I imagine." "I imagine you'll hear whichever version suits you best," Sienna said, keeping her voice even, regardless of what actually happened. Something flickered behind the woman's composed expression. Not quite anger, something colder. "High Priestess Voss," she offered, though Sienna hadn't asked. "I oversee matters of doctrine here, purity of bloodline, legitimacy." A pause, deliberate. "Marriages in particular interest me a great deal, especially ones that arrive this quickly." "Then you'll have plenty to occupy your doctrine with." Voss's smile sharpened at the edges. "I do hope for your sake that whatever this arrangement is, it holds up under scrutiny." She let the words sit there, heavy, before turning toward the door. "The priesthood does so hate being made a fool of." The door clicked shut behind her, and Sienna finally let her spine sag, just slightly, in the privacy of the empty room. She sat on the edge of the too-large bed, hands folded tight in her lap, and let herself feel for one unguarded moment the full weight of what she'd walked into. A fake marriage, a dying king with secrets she hadn't even begun to uncover. A priestess already circling like something that scented blood in still water. And somewhere beneath the palace, in a ward she could no longer freely walk into, her parents lay motionless in beds that were now, however indirectly, exactly as unsafe as she was. "One night," she murmured to the empty room, to no one, to herself. "It's only been one night." Outside her window, the city of Silverhorn glittered on, entirely unaware that everything about it had just quietly, irrevocably begun to change. Darius's private chambers were warded in a way Sienna could feel before she understood it. A low, humming pressure against her skin, the moment she crossed the threshold, like walking into a room where the air itself had been asked to keep a secret. "What is that?" She rubbed absently at her arms, gooseflesh rising despite the fire crackling in the hearth. Scent wards. Sound wards. Darius stood near the window, back to her, hands clasped behind him in a posture she was already starting to recognize as armor. Nothing that happens in this room travels beyond it. Not a heartbeat. Not a word. "Convenient," she said, "for a king who apparently needs to hide things." He turned then, and there was nothing soft in his expression. "Let's be clear about what this is, so there's no confusion later." He crossed the room, stopping a careful, deliberate distance away, close enough to speak quietly, far enough to make a point of the space between them. "In public you are my consort. You stand where I tell you to stand. You say nothing that isn't necessary. In private," he gestured at the room around them, "you are my healer. Nothing more. No affection performed where it isn't required. No questions outside what your work demands. And if I have questions anyway, then you'll learn to keep them to yourself, the same way I have." Something in his tone landed harder than she expected, not cruelty exactly. Old habit worn smooth from years of practice. She recognized the shape of it, because she wore the same armor herself. "Fine," she said. "Rules noted. But you should know, I don't do silence well when someone's dying in front of me. If your treatment requires me to ask uncomfortable questions, I'm going to ask them. Ward or no ward." For the first time, something almost like respect flickered across his face before he smoothed it away. "Duly noted." "Good." She set her bag down on the table between them, businesslike, refusing to let the moment linger long enough to mean anything. "Now sit down. I need to see the wound from last night before it closes wrong." He didn't move at first, just studied her, the way she imagined he studied every threat and every ally, filing her carefully into some category she couldn't guess at. "You're not what I expected," he said finally, "from the woman who threatened to scream down my court this morning." "Give it time," Sienna said, and gestured at the chair. His blood was colder than it should have been. Sienna worked in silence, drawing it slow and careful from the vein at his forearm, watching it pool dark and sluggish into the glass vial. Nothing like the bright, healthy red it should have run. The black threading beneath his skin pulsed faintly with each heartbeat, visible even in the low firelight, like something alive and patient beneath the surface. "This is worse than what I saw in the woods," she murmured, mostly to herself, tilting the vial toward the light. "It's spreading faster than a normal blight progression should." "I'm aware." His voice was carefully even, too even. She glanced up. His jaw was tight, knuckles pale where his free hand gripped the arm of the chair, and she realized, with a small jolt, that he was in considerably more pain than he was letting either of them acknowledge. "You don't have to perform for me in here," she said quietly. "Ward's not listening. Neither is the court." Something flickered behind his eyes, surprise maybe, that she'd noticed at all. "Old habit. Break it, at least while I'm working. I need to know how much this actually hurts, not how much you've decided to admit it hurts." A long pause. Then low. "It feels like drowning. Slowly. From the inside." The honesty of it startled her more than she expected, not the words themselves, but the fact that he'd given them to her at all, unguarded, without the careful distance he'd drawn around himself an hour ago. She capped the vial, set it aside, and reached for a fresh cloth to press against the small wound at his arm. Her fingers brushed his skin. He didn't pull away. "Why let me see that?" she asked, quieter now. "You could have lied. I wouldn't have known the difference." "You'd have known." A ghost of something almost like amusement crossed his face. "You seem like the kind of woman who always knows." Sienna huffed something that wasn't quite a laugh. Focusing hard on the cloth, on the careful pressure of her own hands, rather than on how close he was sitting, or how steady his breathing had gone under her touch. I need 3 more sessions like this, before I'll know if the ashroot mixture is actually slowing the spread, she said, retreating gladly into clinical distance. Same time tomorrow? You're the healer. His voice had gone back to careful, composed, but not quite as far back as before. I go where you tell me. Sienna looked up and found him already watching her. The court moved differently in daylight, Sienna was learning. Less spectacle, more current, dozens of quiet conversations pulling at each other beneath a surface of polite smiles. She kept close to the edges of the hall, exactly as instructed, watching more than participating, until High Priestess Voss materialized at her elbow with the practiced ease of someone who'd been waiting for the opportunity. Lady Consort. Voss's voice carried, deliberately, to the small cluster of nobles nearby. I heard the strangest thing this morning. That you were seen carrying vials of ashroot into the king's private chambers. A pause, sharp as a blade. Peculiar choice of remedy, wouldn't you say? Ashroot's rather more associated with suppression than healing. The words landed exactly where they were meant to. A trap dressed as small talk, an accusation dressed as curiosity. Sienna felt eyes turning toward her, the cluster of nobles no longer pretending not to listen. She kept her expression perfectly still. You're better informed about medicine than I expected of a priestess, Sienna said, letting just enough warmth into her voice to make the words sound like a compliment rather than the deflection it was. Though I'd have thought doctrine kept you too busy for pharmacology. A ripple of quiet amusement moved through the onlookers. Voss's smile thinned. Ashroot has other, less savory uses, Voss pressed, undeterred. I only wonder what a caretaker from the Hollow Ward would need with it, in a king's private chambers, at such odd hours. The same thing any competent healer needs, with any bitter tincture, priestess. Treating a condition that doesn't respond well to prettier medicine. Sienna let her gaze sweep, briefly, deliberately, over the small crowd. Though I suppose if the doctrine has a more effective cure for advanced ashblight, His Majesty would be thrilled to hear it, wouldn't you all? Silence. Voss's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the first real crack Sienna had seen in that composed mask. I only wish to understand my king's well-being, Voss said finally, retreating into practiced piety, as we all should. Then I'm sure you'll be relieved to hear his condition is improving. Sienna held the priestess's gaze, steady, unflinching, the same way she'd once held a dying stranger's gaze in the dark of the woods. Was there anything else, priestess, or have we settled your curiosity for the afternoon? Voss's smile returned, thin and cold as frost. For now. She swept away, and Sienna let out a slow breath through her nose, heart hammering beneath a face she'd kept perfectly, deliberately calm. She'd won this round. She was under no illusion it would be the last one. She found the ledger by accident, tucked behind a false panel in the study at adjoining Darius's chambers, while searching for a second mortar to grind her evening dose. Sienna knew, the moment her fingers brushed its spine, that she wasn't supposed to be holding it. She opened it anyway. Names filled the pages, dozens of them, dates beside each one, small annotations in a tight, economical hand. Moved south, false papers, cleared checkpoint 3, safe. Page after page of it, meticulous, careful, spanning back further than she could easily count. Her breath caught somewhere in her chest. These weren't court records. These were people, priesthood victims, she realized slowly, piecing it together. Names she half recognized from whispered ward gossip about caretakers and hollows who had simply vanished overnight, presumed made examples of. Not examples. Smuggled out. For years. You shouldn't be in here. Sienna startled hard, nearly dropping the ledger, and turned to find Darius filling the doorway, expression unreadable in the low light. I wasn't looking for this. She held it up, half explanation, half confession. I was looking for a mortar. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, and took the ledger from her hands, gently, without force, but his jaw was tight, his shoulders drawn taut in a way she hadn't seen since the throne room. How long? She asked quietly. A long pause. 3 years. The mad alpha, Sienna said slowly, understanding rearranging itself behind her eyes like furniture in a room she thought she already knew. That's not who you are. That's who you're pretending to be, so the priests underestimate you while you, she nodded at the ledger in his hands, do this. If they knew what I was actually doing, he said, voice low, controlled. They'd stop me, and everyone in that ledger would pay for it. Sienna looked at him, really looked, the way she'd looked at his veins in the woods, at his pain in the treatment chair, and saw for the first time the full weight of what 3 years of that performance must have cost him. Why show me now? I didn't, a faint, tired, almost smile. You found it yourself. I'm simply choosing not to lie about what it is. Something warm and unfamiliar unfurled quietly in Sienna's chest, dangerously close to the kind of feeling she'd spent 13 years training herself not to have. For what it's worth, she said softly, I don't think you're mad at all. Darius's gaze held hers a beat too long to be nothing. Careful, he said, quiet, almost gentle. That's not a safe thing to say inside these walls. She didn't look away. I'm getting used to unsafe things. Neither of them mentioned the ledger again. Sienna noticed that. How carefully he avoided it. How carefully she let him. Instead, 3 nights later, he was the one who broke the silence, mid-treatment, apropos of nothing at all. There were 41, Darius said, staring at some fixed point past her shoulder while she worked the needle free from his arm. In 3 years, 41 I couldn't get out in time. Sienna went still, cloth pressed against the small wound, waiting to see if he'd say more, or retreat back behind the wall he'd built so carefully around himself. You count them, she said quietly. Not a question. Every one. His voice had gone rough at the edges, unguarded in a way she hadn't heard from him before, not even in the treatment chair, not even admitting to drowning slowly from the inside. I know their names. I know which ones I was too slow for. That's not a weight anyone's meant to carry alone. It's the only weight I've got. He finally looked at her, something raw and exhausted behind the king's composure. You're the first person I've said that number out loud to. Not the guards who helped me move them, not the healers before you. No one. Sienna set the cloth down slowly, aware of exactly how close she was standing, exactly how far this had already drifted from the clinical distance they'd agreed on that first night. Why me? Because you already know what it costs to keep people alive when the whole world's built to make sure you fail at it. A ghost of something almost like a smile. You don't flinch from the number. You just hold it, like it's yours too somehow. It is, a little. The admission surprised her, coming out of her own mouth. I've been failing at keeping people alive since I was 10 years old. I don't think that number ever gets smaller. You just learn to carry it without it showing. Something shifted in the space between them. Not a touch, nothing so simple as that. Just a quiet recalibration of distance that neither of them named out loud. The rules, she said softly, half reminder, half warning, mostly to herself. We agreed. I remember what we agreed. He didn't move away. This isn't that. Isn't it? A knock cracked against the door before he could answer, sharp and urgent, and whatever fragile thing had been building in the quiet dissolved instantly into 2 very separate, very composed strangers. Enter, Darius called, voice already flattened back into command. A messenger burst in, breathless. Your Majesty, the Priesthood's called a dawn inspection of the Hollow Ward. Sienna's blood went cold. Sienna didn't wait for permission. She was moving before the messenger finished his sentence, already calculating hours until dawn, already thinking of her parents lying exposed and unprotected in a ward, about to be crawled over by Priesthood inspectors. Wait. Darius caught her wrist at the door. Not hard, just firm enough to stop her. Tell me what's wrong. My parents are in that ward. The words came out clipped, urgent, all pretense of composure abandoned. They've been there 13 years. If the priests are doing a full inspection, they'll be looking for exactly the kind of thing I've spent 13 years hiding. What thing? She hesitated, one beat too long, and she watched him notice it, watched something sharpen behind his eyes. I don't have time to explain, she said instead, pulling free of his grip. I need to get into that ward before dawn. You're my consort. You go nowhere without an escort, especially not into a priesthood inspection zone hours before it starts. His voice had gone hard, commanding, every inch the king again. That alone would hand Voss exactly the suspicion she's been hunting for. Then come with me. The words were out before she'd fully thought them through. As my escort. It solves your problem and mine at once. Something flickered across his face. Calculation maybe, or the beginning of understanding just how much she wasn't telling him. Sienna, what's actually in that ward? My parents, she said again, sharper this time. And 13 years of the secret that keeps them breathing. That's all you need tonight. He studied her for a long moment, and she braced for him to push, to demand the rest of it right there in the doorway. Instead, he stepped back and reached for his coat. "Then we move fast," he said. "And you tell me on the way exactly what I'm walking into, so I'm not blindsided defending something I don't understand." Relief and terror tangled together in her chest as they moved through the palace's back corridors, guards falling into step behind them without question. She gave him the barest version she could manage. Her parents, the ash root, the severing that had taken everything from them 13 years ago and left them exactly where the priesthood could find them again tonight. She left out the rest, the part about herself. "You could have told me all of this before now," Darius said quietly, as the ward's outline rose ahead of them in the dark. "I've spent 13 years not telling anyone anything," Sienna said. "Old habits don't unlearn themselves in a week." His hand found hers once, brief, steadying, gone again before either of them had to name what it meant. "Let's go save your parents then," he said. "We'll work on the rest later." The inspection came at dawn exactly as promised, and Voss came with it, sweeping into the ward with a retinue of priesthood officials, eyes already hunting for something to seize on. Sienna stood beside Darius near her parents' beds, spine straight, expression carved into careful neutrality, while Voss moved slowly down the rows, inspecting each hollow with theatrical thoroughness. "How curious," Voss said, stopping at last in front of Sienna's parents, "that the consort's own family happens to reside in this ward." Her gaze flicked up, sharp. "You never mentioned that, Lady Consort, in all our lovely conversations." "You never asked," Sienna said evenly, "and I'm not in the habit of volunteering my personal grief for court entertainment." "Grief?" Voss turned the word over, like she was tasting something bitter. "Is that what we're calling it? I confess I find it a remarkable coincidence, a caretaker's family, hollowed, conveniently positioned for her to visit undetected, all these years. There's no coincidence in tragedy, priestess, only cruelty, and the people forced to live around it." Voss's smile went thin, cold. "His Majesty seems remarkably invested in your family's welfare, for a marriage barely a fortnight old." She turned that same sharp gaze on Darius. "Tell me, Your Majesty, is this personal escort standard practice for every ward inspection, or only the ones involving your consort's kin?" "I attend where my consort's safety requires it." Darius's voice was flat, immovable, every inch the king performing certainty. "I wasn't aware the priesthood required justification for a king's presence in his own kingdom's wards." "Of course not." Voss inclined her head, though her eyes stayed locked on Sienna, missing nothing. "I only note, for the record, how very much attention you've both paid to 2 hollows among hundreds. It does make a priestess curious what precisely makes this pair so worth protecting." Sienna held her ground, held her breath, held the flat, unreadable expression that 13 years of practice had carved into instinct, even as her heart hammered against her ribs, loud enough she was half convinced the whole ward could hear it. Voss lingered a moment longer, then moved on, retinue trailing behind her, inspection continuing down the rows with the same theatrical thoroughness. It wasn't until the priestess was 3 beds away that Sienna allowed herself to exhale. "That was close," she breathed. "Too close," Darius murmured, low enough only she could hear. "She's not looking for evidence anymore, Sienna. She's building a case. There's a difference." Sienna looked down at her parents, unaware, untouched, safe for now, and felt the fragile relief curdle immediately into something colder. They had won this morning. The breakthrough came just past midnight. In the cramped candlelit corner of the palace Sienna had claimed as her private workspace. Her hands were shaking, not from fear this time, but from something closer to disbelief, as she watched the treated serum sample take on the faint, unmistakable shimmer she'd been chasing for weeks. A soul thread, reforming. Not restored, not yet, not fully, but responding. "It's working," she whispered, to the empty room, to no one. "It's actually working." She'd been so consumed by the sample that she hadn't heard the door, hadn't registered another presence in the room, until Darius spoke from just behind her shoulder. "What's working?" Sienna startled, nearly upending the vial, and turned to find him closer than she'd realized, close enough that the candlelight carved warm, gold lines along the sharp planes of his face. "The serum." Her voice came out breathless, giddy in a way she'd barely recognized in herself. "The one I've been building since we made our deal. I think it might actually be able to reverse the severing, not just slow it, reverse it." Something shifted in his expression. Awe, maybe, or the particular kind of hope that hurt to hold on to. Sienna, do you understand what that means? For everyone in that ward? For your parents? I'm trying not to understand it yet, she admitted, in case I'm wrong. You're not wrong. He said it with a certainty that startled her, steady and sure in a way she hadn't earned yet from anyone in this palace. I've watched you work for weeks now. You don't guess. You don't hope your way into conclusions. If you say it's working, it's working. The praise landed somewhere unguarded in her chest, warm and unfamiliar, and she found herself looking up at him instead of at the vial still glowing faintly between her fingers. Careful, she said, echoing his own words back at him from nights ago, though her voice had lost all its earlier sharpness. That's not a safe thing to say inside these walls. No, he agreed, quiet, not moving away. It isn't. The distance between them had narrowed without either of them deciding to close it. Close enough now that she could feel the warmth radiating off him, could see the faint, involuntary flicker of his gaze toward her mouth and back up again, quick, like he was fighting something. Darius, his name, unadorned by title, came out barely above a whisper. He went very still. We agreed, he started. I know what we agreed. He didn't move, neither did she. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the low hiss of the candle and the too loud rhythm of her own pulse. Then Darius exhaled, slow and controlled, and stepped back, not far, but enough. Enough to remind them both what the space between them was supposed to mean. The serum, he said, voice rougher than before. Show me what it needs next. Sienna let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, grateful and disappointed in equal, confusing measure. Time. And a subject. I can't know if it actually works until I test it properly. On someone hollowed. That's not a small risk. Everything I do is a small risk pretending to be a large one, or a large one pretending to be small. She capped the vial with hands that had finally stopped shaking. I need a volunteer. Someone loyal. Someone the priesthood isn't watching. Darius was quiet for a moment, weighing something. There's a boy, 10 years old, hollowed 2 years ago. His mother works kitchens, feeds half my smuggling operation on the side. She'd let you try. She's begged every healer in this palace already, with nothing to show for it. 10 years old, Sienna repeated softly, and felt the weight of it settle into her chest alongside the excitement. If I'm wrong, you said it yourself. You're not wrong. I said that about a sample in a vial. A person is different. She looked at him, searching his face for the reassurance she needed, and hating herself a little for needing it at all. If this fails, and there's a wolf mind trapped in there somewhere still capable of pain, then we'll know, and we'll grieve, and we'll try again smarter. His voice gentled, just slightly. Sienna, nothing you're building gets made without risk. You know that better than anyone in this palace. She nodded slowly, resolve settling cold and clear beneath the fear. Tomorrow night then, after the palace sleeps. I'll arrange it. He hesitated at the door, something unspoken sitting heavy behind his eyes. For what it's worth, whatever happens tomorrow, I don't think less of you for being afraid of it. I'm not afraid of failing, Sienna said quietly, surprising herself with the honesty of it. I'm afraid of being right, and what it means once everyone knows it's possible. He didn't have an answer for that. Neither really did she. The door closed behind him, and Sienna sat alone with the vial, the candle, and the growing dangerous certainty that tomorrow night would change everything. The boy's name was Ren, and his mother's hands shook harder than Sienna's did as she administered the serum in the flickering dark of a servant's storeroom, 3 floors below the palace's sleeping heart. Nothing happened for a long, agonizing minute. Then the boy's chest rose in a breath that seemed somehow deeper than the ones before it. His eyes, vacant for 2 years, his mother had said, empty as glass, flickered. Ren? His mother's voice cracked on the single syllable. The boy blinked, slowly, deliberately. A gesture that had nothing to do with reflex and everything to do with a person choosing, for the first time in 2 years, to look at something. His mother made a sound Sienna would carry with her for the rest of her life, something between a sob and a prayer, both hands pressed to her mouth, watching her son's gaze find her face and unmistakably recognize it. Sienna's own vision blurred. She let it. Just this once, professional composure abandoned entirely in the face of what she was witnessing. It worked. It actually, truly worked. Darius, silent at the door the entire time, crossed the room and gripped her shoulder, brief, fierce, wordless. When she looked up at him, his eyes were suspiciously bright too, and for once he made no effort to hide it. They left the boy with his mother and slipped back through the sleeping palace in a charged, electric silence, the weight of what they'd just done settling into something too large for either of them to name out loud. It was Darius who broke first, pulling her into the shadow of an alcove the moment they were alone in the corridor, hands framing her face with a gentleness that startled her more than any of his composed control ever had. "You just gave that boy his life back," he murmured, voice raw. "Do you understand what you are?" Darius, the rule, unspoken between them for weeks now, screamed somewhere in the back of her mind. She ignored it. "We agreed. I know what we agreed." His thumb traced, feather light, along her cheekbone. "I don't care anymore." The distance between them dissolved. His mouth found hers, careful at first, questioning, and Sienna, 13 years of caution burning away in a single reckless heartbeat, kissed him back. It wasn't gentle for long. His hand slid into her hair, hers fisted in the front of his shirt, and every rule they'd built between them since that first night in the warded chamber shattered at once. Quietly, completely, in the dark of an empty corridor neither of them had thought to check for witnesses. Neither of them noticed the servant's door, half open at the corridor's end, easing silently shut. The morning after felt dangerously, unbearably normal, which was exactly what worried Sienna most. She moved through the palace corridors on her way to the treatment chamber, replaying the corridor, the kiss, the reckless unraveling of every rule she'd sworn to keep, and trying with limited success to convince herself that no one else had witnessed any of it. She was still failing to convince herself when a servant girl fell into step beside her, voice pitched low and urgent. "Lady Consort, a word, quickly." The girl glanced both directions before continuing. "My cousin works the East Servants' Hall. Says High Priestess Voss's people were asking questions this morning, about a corridor near the kitchens, about who might have been seen there, late, after the palace slept." Sienna's stomach dropped straight through the floor. "What kind of questions?" "Specific ones." The girl's eyes were wide, frightened. "Whether anyone saw the king. Whether anyone saw you." "My cousin didn't say anything, but I don't know who else might have." "Thank you," Sienna managed, voice far steadier than she felt. "For telling me." The girl slipped away, and Sienna stood alone in the corridor for a long moment, heart hammering, mind racing through every possible witness, every possible leak. The servant's door. She'd noticed it, hadn't she? Some distant part of her brain registering movement at the edge of her vision, even as she'd kissed him, and dismissed it, too caught up in the moment to weigh the risk. She found Darius in his study within the hour, laying it out for him plainly, watching his expression shift from careful composure into something harder, more calculating. "If Voss has a witness," he said slowly, "she'll wait. Gather more before she moves. She's patient, methodical. That's not comforting. It's not meant to be." He crossed to the window, jaw tight. "But it means we have time. Not much. Enough to prepare, if we're careful." "And the serum?" Sienna asked. "Ren's mother, if word gets out about what I did last night before we're ready." "Then we accelerate everything." His gaze met hers, steady despite the tension in every line of his shoulders. "The plan I've been building for 3 years. It was always going to require a breaking point eventually. Perhaps it simply arrived sooner than I'd hoped." Sienna felt the ground shifting beneath everything she thought she understood about that arrangement. No longer a slow, careful game of politics, but a countdown now, with a witness somewhere in this palace, holding the detonator. "Then we stop being careful," she said, resolve hardening beneath the fear. "We start being fast instead." They spread the maps across his war table late into the night. Smuggling routes, priesthood patrol schedules, the location of every remaining ledger name still trapped within the capital's walls. Sienna traced a finger along the eastern quarter, memorizing details she'd never expected to need, aware of Darius close beside her, aware of how naturally their shoulders had begun to brush without either of them stepping back from it anymore. "If Voss moves against us," she said, "she won't stop at exposing the marriage. She'll come for everything. The serum, the ledger, everyone in it." "I know." His voice was grim, certain, which means we stop protecting the Empire's idea of order and start actually dismantling the thing keeping it in place. "You mean the priesthood." "I mean all of it." He turned to face her fully, something resolute settling into his expression. the mask of the Mad Alpha, finally, deliberately, set aside between them. 3 years, I've told myself patience was strategy. That slow, careful extraction was the only way to save anyone without losing everyone. I'm no longer certain that's true. What changed? You did. He said it simply, without performance, without the careful control she'd grown so used to from him. I watched you give a mother her son back last night. I watched you build something out of nothing, in secret, for people who'll never know your name. I don't want to spend whatever time the blight leaves me being careful anymore, Sienna. I want to spend it fighting. Something fierce and certain kindled in Sienna's chest, chasing out the last of her fear. 13 years she'd survived by staying small, staying quiet, staying hidden. She was tired, bone-deep 13 years tired of surviving instead of living. Then let's fight, she said, properly, together, no more half measures, no more careful little rules neither of us actually believes in. He reached for her hand across the war table, fingers lacing through hers with a certainty that felt nothing like the careful clinical distance they'd started with. There's no undoing this, he said quietly. Once we move against the priesthood directly, there's no version of this where we go back to pretending. Not the marriage, not this. His thumb traced once over her knuckles. Not us. Good, Sienna said, and meant it fully, for the first time in 13 years. I'm done pretending anyway. Outside, the city of Silverhorn slept on, unaware that somewhere above it, in a warded chamber lit only by candlelight, its future had just quietly, irrevocably, been decided. The summons came 3 days later, disguised as nothing more than a routine request. The consort's presence required in the catacombs for a matter of doctrine. Sienna should have known. Should have felt the wrongness of it, the moment the priesthood escort led her down, past the public shrines into passages she'd never once been permitted to see, torchlight flickering weak and orange against walls slick with old, patient damp. The door sealed behind her before she registered the trap had already closed. Lady Consort. Voss emerged from the shadows with 3 robed inquisitors flanking her, each carrying the cold, official calm of people who already knew how this ended.
Thank you for coming so promptly.
I wasn't aware I'd been given a choice. You weren't. Voss's smile held no warmth at all now, the polite mask, finally, fully discarded. We have a witness, Lady Consort, to a certain corridor, a certain kiss, and we have a rather compelling account from a kitchen servant regarding a child, hollowed for 2 years, who woke up 3 nights ago speaking his mother's name. Sienna's blood turned to ice, every careful lie she'd built collapsing at once beneath the weight of what Voss already knew. I don't know what you're— Don't. Voss's voice cracked like a whip. We are well past the point of denial serving either of us. What I want to understand, Lady Consort, is what you are. Because a simple human healer does not reverse a severing. Not with tinctures, not with prayer. She stepped closer, eyes glittering with something between triumph and hunger. So tell me, what exactly did we crown as our king's consort? Sienna's mind raced, calculating exits that didn't exist, allies who couldn't reach her in time. The catacomb door was warded, sealed, and she was alone against 4 priesthood officials who'd clearly planned this for days. I'm exactly what I appear to be, she said, forcing steadiness into her voice, even as her pulse hammered wild beneath it. A healer who found something that worked. Search her, Voss said, almost bored, and the inquisitors moved forward as one. Sienna backed against cold stone, 13 years of careful invisibility screaming at her to run, to fight, to do something, and finding, for the first time in her life, nowhere left to hide. Touch me, she said, low and dangerous, and you'll answer to the king, directly. The king, Voss said softly, closing the last distance between them, isn't here to save you this time, Lady Consort. The door blew inward with a sound like the world cracking open. Darius stood in the wreckage of it, chest heaving, eyes blazing with something far past the composed king's mask Sienna had watched him wear for weeks. Something ancient, furious, entirely unguarded. Step away from her. His voice carried a weight that made even the inquisitors flinch back instinctively. Your Majesty. Voss recovered fast, composure sliding back into place like armor. How fortunate. You can save us all considerable time. Your consort appears to be hiding something rather significant about her nature. Perhaps you'd care to enlighten us before we proceed. She's under my protection. She's under suspicion, Voss shot back, sharp as a blade. And unless you can prove, definitively before this council, that whatever bond exists between you is legitimate, sanctioned, real, not the calculated fiction half this court already suspects, then I have every doctrinal right to proceed with this Inquisition exactly as planned. Sienna's stomach dropped. There was only one proof Voss could possibly mean. One ritual old enough, sacred enough, to satisfy doctrine beyond argument. Darius, she started, already understanding, already terrified of what he was about to offer. Then we'll settle it, he said, voice low, final, eyes never leaving hers, the only way doctrine actually recognizes. Voss's eyes lit with sharp, cold satisfaction. The resonance vow. A ripple of unease moved through the Inquisitors. Even they understood the weight of what he'd just invoked. Sienna had heard fragments of the old texts, whispered warnings about a trial ancient enough to predate the priesthood's own doctrine. A binding so total, so irreversible, that few kings in Silverhorn's history had ever dared attempt it. You don't have to do this, Sienna whispered, moving to him, gripping his arm. There has to be another way. There isn't. His hand covered hers, steady despite everything. And even if there were, Sienna, I wouldn't take it. Do you understand what it does? Her voice cracked, fear finally breaking through 13 years of practiced control. It doesn't just bind us, it forces everything open, every wound, every truth either of us has ever hidden. I know. His gaze held hers, unflinching, certain. I'd rather you see all of me than lose you to a lie neither of us chose. Voss was already gesturing the Inquisitors into ritual formation, torches gathering, ancient words beginning to rise in low, chanting cadence around them. Sienna's heart hammered against her ribs, terror and something fiercer than terror tangled together as the moonlight, impossibly, began bleeding down through some hidden shaft above the catacomb, exactly as the old texts required. There was no more time left to be afraid. Then let's finish it, she said, and took his hand. The moonlight touched them both at once, and the world tore open. Sienna's own memories scattered like startled birds, and in their place came his. Flashes, fragments, a lifetime pressed into a single unbearable instant. She felt the crushing weight of the ash blight, as if it lived in her own veins now, black fire spreading beneath her skin, a slow drowning that never once let up, that he'd carried silently for months without a single complaint. She understood in that moment exactly what it had cost him to sit still through every treatment session and never once let her see how much it hurt. I'm sorry, she thought. Or maybe said, unable to tell anymore where her mind ended and his began. I'm so sorry, I didn't know it was this much. Something answered her, not words, just a feeling warm and steady even through the agony. Not your fault, never yours to carry. Then the current reversed, and it was her memories flooding him now. She felt him standing where she'd stood, 10 years old, watching her parents' souls torn away in a single priesthood ritual, powerless, screaming a name nobody answered. She felt him absorb the exact shape of that helplessness, the exact moment a child had decided the only way to survive was to become invisible, to never again be seen clearly enough to lose. This is why, his thought came, raw with understanding. This is why you hide, why you never let anyone close enough to. Please, she begged silently, unable to bear him seeing the rest of it, the wolf she'd suppressed for 13 years, the last secret standing between them. Please, not that too. But the vow didn't stop for permission. It pulled the truth forward anyway, inevitable as moonrise. The wolf curled tight and starved inside her, 13 years of ash roots smothering, something that had never once stopped clawing to be free. She felt his shock ripple through the bond, felt it settle almost immediately into something that wasn't fear at all. You're like me, his thought came, wondering, fierce. You've been like me this whole time. The pain and the truth crested together, unbearable, absolute. Every wound either of them had ever hidden laid bare in the space between two racing heartbeats. Sienna felt herself breaking open completely, 13 years of careful armor dissolving under moonlight neither of them could fight. Then, between one breath and the next, the tension broke. They collapsed together, hearts hammering in perfect, terrible unison, bound now by something neither doctrine nor distance could ever fully unmake again. Sienna woke, tangled, in Darius's arms, on the cold catacomb floor. The bond between them settled now into something steady, humming low beneath her skin like a second pulse she'd never known she was missing. Voss stood over them both, and for the first time since Sienna had met her, the priestess's composure had cracked entirely. "Immune," Voss breathed, staring at Darius with something between horror and fury. "The bonds made him immune to the blight poison. I can see it. The veins are already clearing." Her gaze snapped to Sienna, sharp and furious. "And you, a hidden wolf, 13 years suppressed, bonded now to the crown itself. Do you understand what you've just become?" "A problem," Darius said, rising slowly, pulling Sienna up with him, positioning himself instinctively between her and the Inquisitors. "For you, specifically. For all of us." Voss's voice had gone brittle. "Dangerous. A king immune to our leverage. A consort with power the doctrine was built specifically to suppress. Do you think we built this caste system by accident? Do you think we'll simply allow the two of you to unmake it?" "You don't have a choice anymore," Sienna said, fighting her feet, finding her voice, the bond humming fierce and steady beneath every word. "It's already done." "No," Voss said softly, something cold and final settling into her expression. "It isn't." She turned, sweeping toward the sealed door, robes snapping sharp behind her. "Gather the council," she called to the Inquisitors, voice already hardening into command. "Effective immediately. Full severing order. Every lower caste soul within the capital walls. No exceptions." The words landed like a physical blow. "That's thousands of people," Sienna said, horror closing cold fingers around her throat. "That's my parents." "Then perhaps," Voss said, pausing at the door, not bothering to turn back, "you should have considered that before deciding your little rebellion was worth the cost." The door sealed shut behind her, and Sienna stood frozen in the sudden silence, the fierce, hard-won certainty of moments ago, collapsing beneath the weight of what she'd just unleashed. Darius's hand found hers, gripping tight, grounding her against the horror threatening to swallow her whole. "We stop this," he said, voice low, fierce, unshakable. "Whatever it takes." Sienna looked at him, really looked, bond humming raw and open between them, every wound they'd just shared still fresh, and felt something cold and resolute settle where the fear had been. "Whatever it takes," she echoed. "Then let's go stop it." The war room felt smaller than it had 3 nights ago, crowded now with the weight of what was coming. Sienna watched Darius pace the length of his map table, jaw set in a way that had nothing to do with strategy, and everything to do with a decision he'd already made without her. "Say it," she said finally. "Whatever you're planning, I can see it on you." He stopped pacing, didn't look at her. "I'm going to walk into the execution grounds tomorrow, alone, and give myself to the priesthood as a bargaining tool. Buy time for the ward evacuations. Buy time for you to get your parents clear." The words landed like a slap. "Absolutely not." "Sienna, no." She crossed the room fast, planting herself directly in his path, refusing to let him retreat into the careful, composed distance he always reached for when a conversation got too dangerous. "You are not walking into a priesthood execution ground alone, so the rest of us can run while they carve you apart. It buys time." His voice was low, controlled, and underneath it she could hear exactly what she'd feared. The old wound, the martyr's arithmetic he'd been running since long before she'd ever met him. 41 names in that ledger I couldn't save fast enough. I am not adding thousands more because I was too much of a coward to offer myself first. That's not courage. Her voice cracked, fury and terror tangled together. That's guilt wearing a crown. You've spent 3 years deciding you're the only one allowed to bleed for this cause, and I am telling you right now, that ends tonight. Something flickered behind his composed mask. Surprise, maybe, that she'd seen it so clearly. What would you have me do instead? Fight. With me, not instead of me. She gripped his hands, bond humming steady and fierce between them, refusing to let him pull away from either the touch or the truth. I watched you count 41 names alone in the dark for 3 years, Darius. I am not letting you add your own name to a list I have to carry by myself. His jaw worked, some old, deep-set resolve finally cracking under the weight of her certainty. If I fail, then we fail together, and it still won't have been because you decided I wasn't worth fighting beside. The silence stretched, heavy, charged, until finally something in his shoulders loosened. Not surrender exactly, but a decision made new. Then tell me your plan, he said quietly, because clearly you already have one. Sienna allowed herself finally, the smallest fierce smile. We don't die for them, Sienna said, spreading the map flat across the table between them. We make them answer to us. Darius watched her, something like awe settling behind the exhaustion in his eyes. Go on. The priesthood's entire power rests on one thing: fear. Fear of the severing. Fear of a caste system they've convinced everyone is permanent, unbreakable. She traced a line from the palace toward the ward, hand steady, despite the enormity of what she was about to say aloud, for the first time. I've been hiding a wolf inside myself for 13 years, Darius. Suppressing it, drowning it in poison because I was taught, because they taught everyone, that being what I am is a death sentence. You're not hiding it anymore. Not a question. He'd felt it himself, through the bond, every truth she carried now visible to him, the way his was visible to her. No. Something fierce kindled behind her voice. 13 years of careful invisibility burning away at last. Tomorrow, when they think they've won, when they think they've broken us down to nothing, I'm going to stop hiding, in front of everyone. The priesthood built their entire doctrine on the idea that people like me shouldn't exist. I intend to prove them catastrophically wrong, in the middle of their own execution ceremony. Darius's expression shifted, understanding, then something close to reverence. The rescued becomes the rescuer. Something like that. She allowed herself a small, humorless smile. But it's not enough for me to reveal what I am. We need every hollow in that capital ready to rise with me, the instant I do. The serum. The serum. She tapped the map, tracing the underground channels she'd spent the last 2 nights memorizing. It works in trace doses, slow release. If we get it into the palace water supply tonight, distributed wide enough to reach every ward in the capital by morning, you could restore hundreds of hollows at once, Darius finished, already grasping the scale of it. All of them waking right as the ceremony begins. Exactly when the priesthood least expects an army. Sienna's pulse raced, the shape of the plan finally, fully forming. They'll parade you out as a broken king, surrender bait for their execution. And in the middle of their own spectacle, we give them an uprising instead. Darius reached across the table, gripping her hand, the bond between them humming with something fierce and certain. Neither of them bothered to hide anymore. 41 names, he said quietly. I've spent 3 years mourning what I couldn't save. Tell me exactly what you need, Sienna Hayes, and I will move heaven and every guard loyal to me to get it done before dawn. Then let's get to work, she said. We don't have much time left to waste being careful. The palace cisterns ran deep beneath the lowest levels, cold and echoing, and Sienna's hands were steady despite the danger humming through every measured pour of serum into the water below. Slow release, she murmured, mostly to herself, checking the concentration against calculations she'd redone a dozen times since midnight. Enough to reach every ward by sunrise. Not so much it burns through the system before the water's even distributed. Darius stood watch at the passage entrance, tension coiled tight through his shoulders, every sense straining for guards who shouldn't be down here but might be anyway. How long, he asked quietly, before we know if it's working? Hours. Maybe longer for the furthest wards. Sienna capped the last vial, hands trembling now with exhaustion rather than fear. I won't know for certain until we're standing in the middle of that execution ground, and it either works, or it doesn't. It'll work. His certainty, steady and unwavering even now, still startled her every time he offered it so freely. You said it yourself. You don't guess your way into conclusions. I said that about a sample in a vial. This is an entire capital's water supply. She allowed herself, briefly, the fear she'd been holding at bay for hours. If I've miscalculated the dosage, then we'll adapt. He crossed the small distance between them, gathering her hands in his, steady despite the danger pressing in from every direction. Whatever happens tomorrow, Sienna, you've already done something no one in this empire believed was possible. Ren's mother believes it. Every name in my ledger believes it, whether they know your face or not. Something in his certainty settled the worst of her fear, and she found herself leaning into the solid warmth of him, bond humming low and steady between them, like a held breath. We need to move, she said finally, reluctantly stepping back. The guards change shift at dawn. We need to be clear of this passage before then. They slipped back through the sleeping palace in careful silence, the weight of what they'd just set in motion trailing behind them like a held breath waiting to release. Sienna's mind raced ahead. Hours now, not days, until everything either succeeded spectacularly or collapsed catastrophically in front of the entire capital. As they reached the final stretch of corridor before their chambers, a runner intercepted them, breathless, urgent. "Your Majesty, Lady Consort." The young guard struggled for breath. "The priesthoods moved up the ceremony, dawn, not midday as announced. They're saying it's to prevent any last interference." Sienna's blood ran cold. Dawn meant hours, not the full day she'd calculated the serum would need. "Then we move faster," Darius said, already turning, urgency sharpening every line of him. "Sienna." "I know." Hope and terror tangled tight in her chest. "We'll just have to trust it's enough." The sky had barely begun to lighten when Sienna dressed in silence, hands steady now with a calm she'd earned through exhaustion rather than confidence. Darius stood across the room, already in the plain, unadorned clothes of a man walking willingly toward his own execution. No crown, no armor, nothing the priesthood could later claim he'd used to defend himself. "You don't have to look like their victim," Sienna said quietly, crossing to straighten the collar he'd left crooked. "Even walking in unarmed. That's rather the point." His hands found hers, stilling them against his chest. "Let them believe, right up until the moment it stops being true, that they've already won." Sienna nodded, throat tight, and let herself have one more moment, just one, before the world outside that door demanded every fierce, careful thing she'd built over the last weeks. If the siren hasn't reached far enough by the time we're standing in front of them, then we improvise. He tipped her chin up, gaze steady despite everything hanging over them both. "You are not the frightened girl who knelt on a ward floor reciting words she didn't believe anymore, Sienna. Whatever happens today, remember that. You haven't been her in weeks." Something fierce and grateful tightened in her chest. "Neither are you the mad alpha they think they're executing." A ghost of a smile, tired and real. "No, I suppose I'm not." They walked the last corridor together, guards falling silently into step behind them. The weight of everything they'd built in the last weeks, the serum, the bond, the fragile, reckless hope of an uprising, trailing in their wake like the first light finally breaking over Silverhorn's rooftops. At the threshold to the execution grounds, Darius paused, turning to her one final time. "Whatever happens out there," he said, low, urgent, "I need you to know, none of this, not one moment of it was the ruse I told the court it was, not after that first night in the woods." "I know." Sienna's voice came steadier than she felt, bond humming fierce and certain beneath every word. "I've known for a while now." He nodded once, resolve settling fully into place, and stepped through the threshold, ahead of her, walking unarmed into a courtyard full of people who believed absolutely that they were about to witness his end. Sienna followed 3 steps behind, exactly as protocol demanded, every sense straining for the first sign the serum had worked, and felt, beneath her own ribs, the wolf she'd suppressed for 13 years stir, restless and ready, waiting for its moment at last. The execution grounds had been dressed for spectacle, banners in priesthood colors, a raised dais, a crowd packed shoulder to shoulder in the pale light of dawn, hungry for the ending they'd been promised. Sienna kept 3 careful steps behind Darius, exactly as protocol demanded, watching him walk unarmed toward the platform where Voss waited with the rest of the High Council, their expressions arranged into practiced, patient triumph. "Silverhorn's Mad King," Voss announced, voice carrying easily across the hushed crowd, who dared believe himself untouchable, who dared bond himself to corruption rather than doctrine. Her gaze flicked once, coldly, toward Sienna. "Today, both errors are corrected." Darius said nothing, climbed the dais steps without hesitation, without a flicker of the fear Sienna could feel humming raw beneath her own ribs. She scanned the crowd instead, desperate, searching for any sign the serum had reached far enough, fast enough. Faces stared back, blank with the particular emptiness she'd spent 13 years learning to recognize in her own parents. Too many, too still. "Please," she thought, urgent, aimed at nothing, at everything. "Please, let it be enough." Voss raised a hand, signaling the ceremonial guard forward, and the crowd's hush deepened into something closer to held breath. Then the ground trembled, faint at first, a shiver beneath Sienna's boots, easy to mistake for nerves. Then, stronger. A low, rolling tremor that rippled outward from somewhere beneath the courtyard itself, rattling banners, sending a visible ripple of unease through the assembled priesthood guard. Voss's composed expression cracked, just slightly, gaze darting toward the crowd. Sienna followed it and felt her heart seize. All across the courtyard, blank, hollow faces were beginning to blink, slowly, deliberately, choosing, for the first time in years, to look at something. The serum had worked. Voss's voice rose, sharp and cracking, ordering the guard to seize control, but her words were already drowning beneath a sound rising from the crowd itself. Hundreds of indrawn breaths, hundreds of names whispered by people who hadn't spoken in years, finally finding their own voices again. Sienna felt it happening inside her too. 13 years of Ashreet suppression finally fully burning away. The wolf she'd caged since childhood, surging forward with a force that stole the breath straight from her lungs. She didn't fight it this time. Her skin rippled, fire and ice chasing each other beneath the surface. And for one suspended heartbeat, the entire courtyard seemed to hold its breath around her. Then she let go completely. The transformation tore through her not as violence but as release. 13 years of held breath finally exhaled. 13 years of careful invisibility shed in a single blazing instant. She rose from the crowd taller than any wolf the courtyard had ever seen, coat the color of moonlight on dark water, eyes burning with everything she'd suppressed since she was 10 years old and powerless. The crowd's gasp rippled outward like a physical wave. Impossible, Voss breathed, staggering back a step, every trace of her composure finally completely gone. You were nothing, a caretaker, I was hiding, Sienna's thought carried, fierce and clear, through the bond blazing wide open now between her and Darius. Not nothing. I was never nothing. All across the courtyard, restored hollows were rising too, some collapsing into disbelieving tears, others turning toward the priesthood guard with an expression Sienna recognized instantly, because she'd worn it herself the moment she'd finally stopped pretending. Rage. Righteous, 13 years overdue rage. Darius, still standing at the center of the dais, met her gaze across the chaos, and something fierce and proud glazed behind his own eyes as he shifted too. Alpha power unleashed at last, no longer performing madness, no longer hiding weakness, simply himself, fully, for the first time in 3 long years. Now, he called, voice carrying like thunder across the trembling courtyard, we answer for every name in that ledger. The priesthood guards scrambled to form ranks, panic finally cracking their disciplined composure. Voss was shouting orders no one seemed inclined to follow anymore. Sienna felt the wolf inside her surge forward, fierce and ready, 13 years of invisibility burning away into something the entire capital would finally undeniably see. The courtyard dissolved into chaos. And Sienna moved through it exactly as she'd trained herself to move through crisis her entire life. Steady, purposeful, cataloging every threat with the same clinical focus she'd once reserved for dying patients. She fought back to back with Darius, an instinct that needed no words between them, the bond carrying every warning, every shift in momentum, faster than either of them could have spoken it aloud. Where his raw alpha power tore through the priesthood guard's front lines, she moved with precision instead, reading weaknesses, guiding restored hollows into formation, turning a scattered crowd of the newly awakened into something resembling an army. Left flank, she called, and felt rather than heard Darius adjust instantly, trusting her without question. A guard lunged toward her, and she met him with a speed she'd never once allowed herself to use in 13 careful years. The wolf's instincts dieting muscles that had spent a lifetime pretending not to know how to fight. Around her, the priesthood's composed authority was crumbling in real time. Inquisitors who'd relied entirely on fear and ritual, finding themselves suddenly, catastrophically outmatched by people who no longer had any reason left to fear them. She caught sight of Voss, near the collapsing dais, shrieking orders that scattered guards no longer bothered obeying, her carefully cultivated power dissolving the moment the crowd stopped believing in it. It's over, priestess, Sienna called, wolf form lending her voice a resonance that carried easily across the chaos. You built your entire doctrine on people believing they had no other choice. They know better now. Voss's composed mask finally completely shattered. You have no idea what you've unleashed. I know exactly what I've unleashed, Sienna said. Everything you spent generations trying to bury. The last of the priesthood guard broke ranks entirely, scattering before the combined force of an Alpha King finally unrestrained, and an army of the newly restored, fighting for every year that had been stolen from them. Sienna found Darius amid the settling chaos, breathing hard, the ash-blight veins she'd spent weeks treating now fully, visibly clear beneath his skin for the first time since she'd met him bleeding out in the woods. "It's done," he said, disbelief and relief tangled together in his voice. Around them, the grand execution grounds, built to celebrate his death, lay in smoking, overturned ruin, the priesthood's authority burned away as thoroughly as the banners scattered across the courtyard stones. Sienna found her parents exactly where she'd left them hours before, except now her mother's eyes tracked toward her the moment she entered the ward, recognition blooming slow and unmistakable across a face that hadn't held it in 13 years. "Sienna?" Her mother's voice cracked on the single syllable, disbelieving, reaching. Sienna crossed the room and gathered both her parents into her arms. 13 years of careful, unspoken grief, finally breaking loose all at once. Unashamed, unguarded, in front of an entire ward full of families experiencing the exact same impossible reunion. "I found something," she managed, through tears she made no effort to hide. "I told you I would." Later, after the ward had settled into disbelieving, joyful chaos, after the last of the priesthood's scattered remnants had been rounded up by guards no longer loyal to anyone but the crown, Darius found her still sitting between her parents' beds, exhausted, radiant, thoroughly unwilling to leave their side. "The court's assembling," he said gently. "What's left of it, anyway. There's something I need to do, and I'd like you standing beside me when I do it." Sienna rose, kissed her mother's forehead, promised she'd return before nightfall, and let him lead her back through a palace already transforming under the weight of everything they'd just unmade together. The throne room looked different in the aftermath, banners torn, gold dulled with smoke, but somehow more honest than she'd ever seen it, stripped finally of the performance that had governed it for generations. Darius stood before what remained of the court, nobles, restored hollows, guards and citizens alike, gathered in a hall that had never once held such a mixture before, and reached for Sienna's hand. 13 years ago, he said, voice carrying clear and steady across the hushed hall. This empire decided some souls mattered less than others. Today, that ends. He turned to her, something fierce and certain blazing behind his eyes. Sienna Hayes has proven, beyond any doctrine's argument, exactly what a soul this empire tried to erase is actually capable of. He lifted her hand, turning to face the crowd fully. "I crown her not merely as consort," he said, "but as Luna, ruling equal, not because doctrine demands it. Doctrine's already proven itself catastrophically wrong, but because she has earned it, every single day since the moment she chose to save a dying stranger's life, instead of walking past him in the dark." The hall erupted, not in the practiced applause of a court performing loyalty, but something rawer, louder, genuinely earned. Sienna looked out over a capital finally beginning to remember what it meant to be whole, felt the wolf inside her settle at last into quiet, hard-won peace, and found Darius's steady gaze waiting for hers, exactly where it always seemed to be now. "No more hiding," he murmured, "just for her." "No more hiding," she agreed, and let the entire capital see her smile.